There are going to be plenty of opportunities tonight to get to know people in the room. I think most of us know each other. So I'm going to dispense with individual introductions at this point, but you will have other opportunities. That song that you just heard, Who Dies, was sent to me by Jane Manassian. And I thought it was perfect for getting us into the right mood for this session tonight. It is sung by a Canadian folk singer, and you can find it on YouTube if you want to get the words. The words are amazing. So thank you, Jane, for that. So for those of you who are new to this whole Date with Death Club thing, I want to let you know that it is designed to help us confront our own mortality in our community together. Our hope is that doing so can inspire a more meaningful life. The multi-session curriculum was developed by a UU minister, Dr. Susan Johnston. In the last session, we worked on getting comfortable with talking about death and changing negative attitudes about aging. Tonight, we're going to continue on that path, increasing our comfort with death talk and explore our fears about death and dying. We'll also discuss the meaning of a good death. What does that mean? And then especially, what does that mean for each of us? I want to start tonight with a reading by Judy Leaf. She is a renowned Buddhist teacher and author of many meditations. And she writes, what do we actually mean by the word death? The word conjures up a host of vague and troubling thoughts and emotions. At the literal level, we recognize death by such obvious physical signs as the heart stopping, the body not moving, the cessation of breathing, or flat lines on a screen. But that's only a small fraction of what the word death evokes. Beyond that very literal understanding of death, we have all sorts of theories of what death is really about, and all sorts of hopes and fears about it. We need to take a deep look at those hopes and those fears and ask ourselves, what exactly is it that we fear? And what exactly are those hopes? The point of such questioning is not to come up with some correct view of death. Instead, the point is to examine our own assumptions and beliefs, whatever they may be. And that is our challenge for tonight, folks. Continue to build our confidence in talking about death without it being a morbid subject, facing our own mortality, and thinking through how we envision our own death in a way that lessens our fears and anxieties about it. As I mentioned in the last session, my own passion for this work emanates from two experiences with death in my family. My father, who at the age of 46, lay in a semi-comatose state for 1 year after suffering a sudden brain aneurysm. And my mother, who died last year at the age of 104, dying cell by cell over a period of 3 years. So I've had a lot of time to think about death and dying and what my current wishes are, but that doesn't mean I have all the answers. And I'm pretty sure that no one has all the answers because they are deeply personal and they're different for each person. Tonight, we want to invite you to reflect on your own thoughts about this and share them with others in small groups. So let's move to our first exercise. What are your fears about death and dying? We're going to break into small groups of 4 to discuss this question. I'd like to ask you to make sure that you know each other, that you note your group number, and you appoint a scribe who will report back to the larger group when the session breakout group is over. So let's do the breakout group. I want to thank you for that, for bearing with us with the technology and for expressing your thoughts, and especially for sharing those very deep fears. Those are powerful. And I think the death and dying literature bears out much of what we said here, although I think you all could add to that literature quite nicely. I went looking in the literature for what studies are finding about what other people's fears are. And what I found was that most research about fears of death is about people who are facing a fatal disease or have received a diagnosis, a fatal diagnosis. And I wanted to find out more what people who are not facing imminent death might say. And so I found one study that interviewed people over the age of 80, all of whom do not confront a fatal illness. And so I found one that interviewed people over 80 who are still living in their community. It was 263 people, and all of them live alone. And this is what they said. If I could have the next slide, please, Sam. They said, like many of you, it's not death itself that is frightening, it's how we die. The fear of a sudden debilitating illness, heart attack or stroke that completely changes your life. The fear of dying suddenly, and people didn't mention people who are alone dying and not being found. You mentioned fear of being a burden to family. In some of this work, they found that people express fears of their advance directives not being honored. And it's funny, that was in both respects. Some people were worried about people being kept alive against their wishes. And then there were other people who were afraid of euthanasia against their will. I think that's an important point too. Mm-hmm. And it's also important to say that in this study, not everyone expressed fear. Some people said that they knew that death was inevitable, that they had lived a good life, that they accepted what would come next. So now let's move on to the second exercise. The question for this exercise is, given your fears that we just discussed, what might help make you less worried about dying? In other words, the theme for tonight is what makes for a good death in your mind. So first, we'll think about that generally, what makes for a good death. And then, I'm just going to stick with that. What makes for a good death in general? And in another exercise, we'll talk about what makes for a good death for you. So again, make sure you know each other, patients, pre-bereaved and bereaved family members, and healthcare providers. And these were the top 3 themes that were consistent on all those groups. And the first theme includes the death scene, many of the things you all talk about, who's there, where you are, when it happens, and how it happens. And the thing of dying in one's sleep and being prepared for the death, like a lot of the things you mentioned, having your paperwork in order, your funeral arrangements, your thoughts about how you want things to go when you die. The second one concerned a worry about pain and how to get pain-free. And the third included statements that referred to being at peace, again, which most of you mentioned, and an absence of being afraid and depressed, having to do with emotional well-being. There were other themes too in this study, religiosity and spirituality. That's one of the things that was mentioned. Life completion, I think you all actually used that word. Saying goodbye and thinking that you've lived a good life and that you have this feeling that you can accept death. And also treatment preferences was a theme. And having control over treatment. Dignity, again, which all of you mentioned. respect as an individual, having quality of life, that life is worth living even to the end. And another thing that wasn't mentioned tonight was having a good relationship with healthcare providers, knowing that they are comfortable talking with you about death and respecting your wishes and helping you get the treatment that you have requested. In the next slide, we can see that there were differences amongst these stakeholders between family members and patients. What gave family members a sense of a good death was not quite the same of what gave the dying person a sense of a good death. Family perspectives, including life completion issues, quality of life issues, dignity issues, and the presence of family. And it's interesting that the patient's top theme was religiosity and spirituality. So it's also important to note in the next slide.
That one.
Yeah, thank you.
There we go.
It's really important here to stop and think about the fact that not everyone has an access to a good death. We know that racial and ethnic minorities don't get the same access to health care, that they experience early death more than Caucasians do, and that they in general have low levels of trust in medical establishments. So it's harder to have a good life if you don't experience trust that your physical well-being will receive timely attention. And it's also harder to experience a good death if their circle of family and friends, when epidemics are ravaging their community more so than other communities. So now let's quickly go to exercise 3. And in this exercise, we're going to ask you to imagine a scenario in which you've just met with a medical provider you trust, and the doctor has just given you a diagnosis that will prove to be fatal. There are 3 possibilities for this scenario. 1, you have 6 hours of warning. 2, you have 6 days of warning. And 3, you have 6 months of warning. And I'd like to ask you all to think about which one of these you would choose if you could, and which one of any, if any of them, you have a strong aversion to. And we're going to again break out into groups, but this time we're going to only have 3 groups, 1 for each of these scenarios. And so each of you will be assigned to one of the scenarios, not necessarily the one that you would choose. And I'm going to ask you to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each one. And then also, what would make the time that you have left meaningful, and what would make it more difficult? So the first question is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of your scenario? And what would make your time more meaningful or more difficult? Yeah, so group 1 will be, you have 6 hours to live. You've just found out that you have 6 hours to live. Group 2 will be, you have just found out that you have 6 days to live.
Oh, days.
Group 3, you have just found out that you have 6 months to live.
I think I prefer group 3.
Again, I'd like you to put a scribe, and you will have 15 minutes for this exercise. That we pick up in the future, and I'm sorry, but we're out of time. And I do want to, gosh, I'm so grateful to all of you for your deep sharing, your deep honesty. And I'm overwhelmed with the list that we've made, and we are going to send those to you. And I hope you will take this tonight and think about your own death in this way of making plans ahead for the parts that you can control, knowing that you can't always have everything that's in your plan. But I do think it's important to think about what would make a good death for you personally. I want to go to the next slide, if I could, please. The next session is going to be, what does death with dignity mean? We're going to explore the ins and outs of medical aid in dying, which some of you have referenced tonight. including its legal status in the United States and what it means here. Senator Will Brownsberger is going to be with us for this session to provide an update on the law here in Massachusetts that's being considered. And we'll also review other legal and ethical ways to hasten death, being sure to explore concerns about ableism that are a part of this landscape. So thank you all again for being here, and I want to close with a beautiful poem by Mary Oliver, and I'm going to ask Lillian to read that poem.
And thank you very much, Jackie and committee.
Yes, Jackie.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Jackie.
to giving us this
Okay.
opportunity. Yeah.
When
Thank you
death
very
comes.
Yeah.
By Mary Oliver. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut. When death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through that door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and sisterhood. And I look upon time as no more than an idea. And I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it is over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world.